If you don't bring money into this house, then you're just another expense, my husband said during our anniversary dinner. I smiled, folded my napkin, and quietly agreed. That was the moment our marriage truly ended. The dining room smelled like rosemary chicken and the vanilla candles I'd lit an hour earlier. I had spent the entire afternoon preparing Richard's favorite meal, just like I had every year since 1988. The good china sat between us, pale cream with tiny gold edges that my mother gave us as a wedding present. Outside the window, rain tapped softly against the glass, blurring the streetlights of our quiet Ohio neighborhood into pale yellow smudges. 38 years of marriage reduced to silence and cold food. Michael sat across from us beside his wife Claire, both of them avoiding eye contact the way people do when they know something ugly is coming. Richard swirled the wine in his glass before taking another sip. Expensive wine now. He liked expensive things these days. Expensive watches. Expensive golf clubs. Expensive friends who laughed too loudly at his jokes. I'm serious, Evelyn, he continued, leaning back in his chair. I've worked my whole life while you sat comfortably at home. Claire gave a small nod beside him, almost too slight to notice. But I noticed. Over the years, I had learned to notice every tiny expression people made when they believed I wasn't paying attention. I folded my hands carefully in my lap so no one would see the trembling in my fingers. Comfortably, I repeated softly. Richard sighed dramatically, like a man exhausted by unreasonable burdens. You know what I mean. The kids are grown. We're older now. Everything costs more. I'm tired of carrying everything alone. Carrying everything. The words settled heavily inside my chest. For nearly 4 decades I had raised our son, cared for Richard's mother through her long illness, balanced every bill, cleaned every room, cooked every holiday meal, remembered every birthday, every doctor appointment, every tax deadline, every tiny invisible detail that kept our lives running smoothly. But none of those things came with a paycheck. So to Richard they no longer counted. Michael cleared his throat awkwardly. Dad's just stressed about work, Mom. Claire reached for her wine glass. I think what Richard means is that modern couples usually split things more evenly now. Modern couples. I almost laughed at that. Claire worked part-time at a boutique downtown and spent most afternoons posting pictures online about self-care and luxury skincare products. Meanwhile, I had spent the morning scrubbing grease from the oven before driving 40 minutes to pick up Richard's dry cleaning because he had forgotten again. Richard set down his fork with a sharp clink against the plate. From now on we keep separate finances. Separate responsibilities. Each person handles their own expenses. The room went still. Rain against glass. The hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. Claire staring down into her wine. Michael rubbing his wedding ring nervously. Richard waiting for me to argue. Waiting for tears. Waiting for me to beg him to reconsider. Instead, I lifted my water glass and took a slow sip. Then I nodded once. All right, I said quietly. Richard blinked. All right. You're right, I replied. From now on, each person can take care of themselves. For the first time that evening, uncertainty flickered across his face. Just for a second. Then it disappeared beneath that familiar expression of smug satisfaction. He thought he had won something that night. He had no idea how much his life depended on the woman he had just called worthless. The next morning, I woke up before sunrise out of habit. For 38 years, my body had learned Richard's routines better than my own. Coffee at 6:15. Toast lightly browned, never burnt. 1 packet of raw sugar, never 2. The newspaper folded beside his plate before he came downstairs. I lay still in bed for a long moment, staring at the pale gray ceiling while rainwater slid slowly down the bedroom window. The house was quiet except for the old heating vents clicking softly inside the walls. Beside me, Richard snored peacefully, one arm stretched across the mattress as though nothing important had happened the night before. I turned my head and studied his sleeping face carefully. Age had softened him in some ways. His dark hair had faded silver at the temples. Fine lines spread around his eyes from years of smiling at clients and golf buddies and country club dinners. But somewhere along the way, kindness had disappeared from his face completely. I slipped quietly out of bed and walked downstairs barefoot. The hardwood floor felt cold beneath my feet. Normally, I would have started breakfast immediately. Instead, I poured myself a single cup of coffee and sat alone at the kitchen table. Outside, the neighborhood still slept beneath the wet Ohio morning. The maple tree in our front yard swayed gently in the wind, scattering red leaves across the driveway. Richard always complained I never swept quickly enough. I wrapped both hands around my coffee mug and listened to the silence. It was strange how loud a house could feel when you stopped filling it with yourself. At 6:37 exactly, I heard Richard's footsteps upstairs. The bathroom sink ran. Closet doors opened and shut. A few minutes later, he entered the kitchen wearing his navy robe and reading glasses. He stopped when he saw the empty stove. "You did not make breakfast?" he asked. I looked up calmly. "I thought we agreed we were each responsible for ourselves now." He frowned slightly, confused by the gentleness in my voice. "Evelyn, do not start acting childish." Childish? I almost smiled into my coffee. There had been a time when that word could ruin my entire day. Now it floated past me like smoke. Richard opened the refrigerator with unnecessary force and stared inside. Eggs, bacon, fresh fruit, everything exactly where I always kept it. He simply did not know what to do with any of it. I watched him stand there for several seconds before he finally pulled out yogurt and slammed the refrigerator shut harder than necessary. "I have a meeting downtown at 9, he muttered. "Then I suggest leaving early," I replied softly. "Traffic gets bad near Interstate 71 after 8. Usually, I would have already checked his calendar, printed directions if construction caused delays, and reminded him which clients preferred formal presentations versus casual conversation. Richard sat at the table scrolling through emails on his phone. His jaw tightened more with every swipe. Finally he looked up. "Where is my blue tie?" I took another sip of coffee. "I do not know." "You always know." "Not anymore." The words settled heavily between us. Upstairs I heard the dryer buzzer ring. Normally I would have folded his laundry before the wrinkles set in. Instead I stayed exactly where I was. Richard stared at me for a long moment, as if trying to understand who was sitting across from him. But the truth was simple. For years, he had only noticed me when something was missing. 20 minutes later, he left the house wearing the wrong tie and carrying yesterday's presentation folder instead of today's. I watched through the kitchen window as he backed his Mercedes out of the driveway too quickly, spraying rainwater across the curb. Then the house fell silent again. I expected to feel sad. Instead, I felt something unfamiliar. Space. For the first time in nearly 40 years, the morning belonged entirely to me. 3 days later, the house no longer moved to the rhythm Richard was used to. Small things began slipping first. Quiet things. The kind nobody notices until they stop happening. On Thursday morning, I found a damp towel crumpled on the bathroom floor beside his side of the sink. By Friday, 2 coffee cups sat forgotten in the living room beside his leather recliner. A stack of unopened mail leaned dangerously near the fruit bowl because nobody had sorted it into neat piles marked urgent, personal, and business. Richard noticed everything without admitting he noticed anything. That afternoon, he stormed into the kitchen while I sat peacefully working on a crossword puzzle near the window. "Why did the electricity bill almost get paid late?" he demanded. I looked up calmly. "I assumed you were handling your own expenses now." His mouth tightened immediately. "You know I have been busy." Busy. I remembered that word too. Busy was what Richard called himself whenever he wanted permission to ignore everyone else's labor. "The account information is in the drawer beside the refrigerator," I said quietly. "Unless you moved it." He opened the drawer roughly, shuffling papers with growing irritation. I watched him from across the kitchen table while sunlight spilled softly through the curtains onto the hardwood floor. For years, I would have stood immediately to help him. I would have found the bill, logged into the account, fixed the problem before his frustration grew sharp enough to cut the room apart. But now I simply returned to my crossword puzzle. Eventually he found the paperwork himself. He muttered something under his breath and walked away. That evening Michael stopped by unexpectedly after work. His tie hung loose around his neck, and dark circles shadowed his eyes. "Dad called me 3 times today," he sighed while standing near the kitchen counter. "About what?" I asked. Michael rubbed his forehead tiredly. "He said you are trying to punish him." I almost laughed at the absurdity of it. Punish him. as though my absence from his responsibilities counted as cruelty. Your father wanted independence, I replied softly. I am respecting his wishes. Michael shifted uncomfortably. He had inherited Richard's height but not his confidence. Even at 40 years old, he still spoke carefully whenever family conflict appeared. Claire thinks things have gotten tense lately. There it was again. Claire thinks. Claire says. Claire believes. My son had slowly begun speaking through his wife years ago without realizing it. Does Claire also think your father can survive without someone remembering his blood pressure medication every morning? I asked gently. Michael looked down at the counter. Silence answered for him. I opened the refrigerator and removed leftover chicken soup I had made earlier that week. Enough for one person. Would you like dinner? I asked. I already ate. Another silence stretched between us. Finally Michael spoke quietly. Dad said you have changed. I placed the soup container onto the counter carefully before meeting my son's eyes. No, I said softly. I think your father is simply meeting the version of me that existed underneath the work. Michael did not know how to answer that. Before leaving, he hugged me awkwardly near the front door. The gesture felt unfamiliar. Now like trying on an old coat that no longer fit properly. After he drove away, I stood alone on the porch watching the last traces of sunlight disappear behind the wet autumn trees. Inside the house, Richard sat upstairs on a business call, his voice tense and impatient through the ceiling vents. Somewhere along the way, he had mistaken care for weakness. Now the absence of it was slowly hollowing out his entire life. The following week, Richard began losing things. Not important things at first. Reading glasses left somewhere upstairs. Car keys buried beneath unopened envelopes. A client lunch scheduled on the wrong afternoon because nobody had reminded him to update the calendar hanging beside his office desk. Small cracks spreading quietly through the polished surface of his carefully controlled life. I noticed all of it without saying a word. One cold Tuesday morning, I found him standing in the laundry room staring helplessly at the washing machine. The sharp smell of detergent filled the air while one of his white dress shirts spun endlessly beside a red golf towel he had accidentally tossed in with it. Pink water sloshed softly behind the glass door. Something is wrong with this machine, he snapped the moment he saw me. I looked at the shirt calmly. No, I replied. The machine works perfectly. He followed my gaze toward the pale pink fabric and muttered a curse under his breath. Years ago, I would have rushed to save the shirt before the color set permanently. I would have apologized for not catching the mistake first, even though it would not have been mine. Instead, I simply walked past him and poured myself another cup of coffee. The silence between us had become something solid now. Not angry. Not dramatic. Just heavy enough that Richard could no longer ignore it. That afternoon, Claire invited herself over while Michael was still at work. I heard her heels clicking sharply across the hardwood floor before she appeared in the kitchen wearing a cream-colored coat that probably cost more than my first car. Her perfume reached the room before her voice did. Evelyn, she said carefully, placing her designer handbag onto the counter. I think we need to talk. I folded the dish towel in my hands and waited. Claire smiled politely, but there was tension around her eyes. Richard has been under a lot of pressure lately. Has he? I asked softly. She crossed her arms. You know what I mean. Michael says things at home have become uncomfortable. Home. Funny word. I wondered when exactly this house had stopped feeling like mine to them. Claire sighed dramatically before continuing. I just think after all these years, maybe this is not the time to start making some kind of statement. Statement. As if my silence had become an inconvenience to everyone else. I turned toward the sink slowly and rinsed my coffee cup beneath warm water. Did Richard tell you what he said to me that night? I asked quietly. Claire hesitated. He was frustrated. No, I replied gently. He was honest. That seemed to unsettle her more than anger would have. Claire stepped closer, lowering her voice. Look, I know older couples go through phases. But men like Richard need support. Especially at his age. Men like Richard. I almost smiled at the phrasing. Successful men. Important men. Men accustomed to women quietly carrying the invisible parts of their lives without recognition. Interesting, I said softly while drying the cup with slow, careful movements. Because Richard recently informed me that supporting someone without income makes them a burden. Claire's face stiffened immediately. For the first time since entering the kitchen, she looked uncertain. Outside, wind rattled the bare tree branches against the windows, while the late afternoon sky darkened into steel gray. "That is not exactly what he meant," she said finally. "It sounded exact enough to me." Claire picked up her handbag abruptly. "You are being stubborn." I looked directly at her then. Calmly. Steadily. "No," I said. "For the first time in my life, I am simply standing still instead of carrying everyone else." After she left, the house grew quiet again. I walked slowly upstairs toward the small cedar chest at the back of my closet. Inside were decades of documents Richard had never once bothered to organize himself. Insurance papers, property records, investment accounts, old tax files. I opened the folder resting carefully at the bottom beneath faded photographs and yellowing greeting cards. My maiden name still appeared neatly across several documents in dark blue ink. Evelyn Harper. Not Evelyn Bennett. Harper. I ran my fingers slowly across the paper while memories returned in fragments. My father's voice. The lake property. The inheritance Richard once called our blessing, during the early years when his business nearly collapsed. Funny how men forget the hands that steady them, once they learn how to stand comfortably again. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like this video and share it with someone who understands the silent sacrifices women make every single day. I would truly love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and tell me. Do you think Richard realized Evelyn's value too late? And if you enjoy emotional family drama stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story. 2 mornings later, I drove to downtown Columbus alone for the first time in years without telling Richard where I was going. The sky hung low and pale above the highway, and the windshield wipers moved steadily across the glass while old jazz played softly through the car speakers. Traffic crawled near the interstate exits, but for once, nobody sat beside me sighing impatiently or criticizing my route. I realized halfway through the drive that I felt strangely calm, almost invisible. And after spending decades being needed every minute of every day, invisibility felt peaceful. The law office stood inside an old brick building near the courthouse, the same place Richard and I had visited nearly 20 years earlier when his company almost failed. Back then we had walked into that office terrified we might lose everything. Richard had been sweating through his dress shirt while pretending he was still in control. I remembered how tightly he squeezed my hand in the elevator that day. Funny how fear makes people grateful. Funny how success makes them forget. "Mrs. Bennett," the receptionist said warmly as I entered. "It has been a long time." I smiled politely and removed my gloves. "Too long." A few minutes later, Harold Stein greeted me personally from his office doorway. He looked older now, thinner. His silver hair had almost completely disappeared, leaving only soft wisps above tired eyes. But his voice remained kind. "Evelyn Harper," he said with a small smile. "I was wondering when I might see you again." Harper, not Bennett. Hearing my maiden name spoken aloud after so many years felt oddly grounding, like finding an old photograph of yourself before life slowly taught you to shrink. Harold gestured toward the leather chair across from his desk. "How can I help you?" Rain tapped gently against the office windows while I removed several folders from my purse and placed them carefully onto the desk between us. Property records, trust agreements, investment documents. Harold adjusted his glasses slowly as he reviewed the papers one by one. The room smelled faintly of old books and coffee. Finally, he looked up at me quietly. "Does Richard know you are here?" "No," I answered. "And I would prefer to keep it that way for now." Harold leaned back slightly, studying my face with the careful expression of a man who had spent decades watching marriages unravel inside quiet offices. "Are you planning to leave him?" The question settled softly into the room. Outside, a police siren echoed somewhere far down the street before fading into the rain. I looked down at my hands resting neatly in my lap. Hands that had packed school lunches, balanced checkbooks, planted gardens, folded laundry, signed permission slips, held sick children through long nights, and steadied a frightened husband while his business nearly collapsed all those years ago. "I do not know yet," I admitted softly, "but I need to understand exactly where I stand." Harold nodded once and opened another folder. Well, he said carefully, based on these records, quite a bit of the foundation was built from your inheritance. Foundation. Such a simple word for something that had carried another person's entire life. He explained everything slowly while sliding papers across the desk toward me. The lake property remained solely under my family trust. Several early investments connected to Richard's business had originated directly from money my father left me before he passed away. Even the down payment on our current home had come primarily from my account, though over the years Richard had begun speaking about everything as if he alone had built it from nothing. Most people forget history once comfort settles in, Harold said quietly while organizing the paperwork again, especially when someone else has been quietly protecting them from consequences. I stared toward the rain-covered windows. Protecting them from consequences. That was exactly what marriage had become for me. Not partnership. Protection. Invisible labor wrapped so tightly around Richard's life that he no longer recognized it existed. Before I left, Harold handed me copies of every document inside a thick cream-colored envelope. Keep these somewhere safe, he said gently. I nodded and slipped the envelope carefully into my purse. Then I paused near the office door before turning back toward him. Harold, I said softly, do you think people can spend years loving someone without ever truly seeing them? He looked at me for a long moment before answering. Yes, he said quietly. And sometimes the saddest part is that they only realize what they lost after the silence begins. By early November, the tension inside the house had become impossible to hide from anyone. Richard no longer came home relaxed. Doors closed harder. Phone calls sounded sharper. Even the dog from next door stopped barking whenever his car pulled into the driveway, as though the entire neighborhood could feel the pressure gathering around him. One Thursday evening, he arrived home nearly 2 hours later than usual. I sat in the living room beside the lamp with a hardcover novel resting unopened in my lap, while rain drifted softly against the windows again. Ohio autumn seemed determined to drown the world in gray that year. Richard loosened his tie aggressively as he entered the house. You could have answered your phone, he snapped immediately. I looked up calmly. It was charging upstairs. I called 4 times. I know. He stared at me, waiting for concern that never arrived. His shoulders sagged slightly before he tossed his briefcase onto the chair near the dining room. My presentation today was a disaster, he muttered. I could not find half the updated reports. I turned one page in my book slowly, although I had not read a single sentence. That is unfortunate. Richard laughed bitterly under his breath. You really do not care anymore, do you? The question lingered between us longer than he intended. I closed the book gently and looked at him for a long moment before answering. I cared for this family every single day for 38 years, I said quietly. I simply stopped rescuing people who believe my effort has no value. His expression hardened immediately. That is not fair. Fair. Another interesting word. Was it fair when you reduced my entire life to a paycheck I never received? I asked softly. Richard opened his mouth to respond, then stopped. For the first time since all of this began, I saw something unfamiliar flicker behind his anger. Not guilt exactly. Fear. He turned away first. Claire and Michael are coming Sunday for dinner, he muttered while loosening his cufflinks. I told them 6 o'clock. Then you should probably plan the meal, I replied. Silence again. Heavy silence. The kind that slowly forces truth into places people spent years avoiding. Sunday arrived cold and windy. Dry leaves scraped across the driveway while low clouds pressed heavily over the neighborhood. Around 5:30, I heard Richard struggling in the kitchen. Cabinet doors opened and slammed repeatedly. Something burned slightly. The smoke detector chirped once before falling quiet. I remained upstairs folding my sweater slowly inside the bedroom closet. Eventually Michael called from downstairs. Mom! I walked into the kitchen to find chaos waiting for me. Flour covered part of the counter. 2 uncooked chickens sat awkwardly in the sink while Richard stood staring at a recipe on his phone like a man trying to solve a foreign language. Claire leaned against the refrigerator with barely concealed irritation while Michael silently opened and closed drawers searching for serving utensils. Nobody spoke at first. Then Claire sighed dramatically. This is ridiculous. Richard rubbed his forehead. The grocery store was out of half the ingredients. I looked calmly toward the stove where potatoes boiled over into cloudy water. You turned the heat too high, I said quietly. Richard exhaled sharply. Could you please just help for once? For once. The words almost made me smile. Claire crossed her arms immediately. Honestly, Evelyn, this whole thing has gone far enough. I reached forward calmly and lowered the burner beneath the pot. Steam drifted softly into the kitchen air. What exactly has gone far enough? I asked. Claire looked genuinely stunned that I challenged her at all. This attitude, she replied. Punishing everyone because Richard said something insensitive. I glanced around the kitchen slowly. At my exhausted son. At the uncooked dinner. At the man who had spent weeks discovering how difficult ordinary life became without invisible labor cushioning every mistake. No, I said softly. What you are seeing is what happens when a woman finally stops donating herself to people who only notice her when she disappears. Michael looked down immediately. Richard said nothing. Even Claire fell silent. Outside, wind rattled the windows while the smell of burned garlic lingered heavily through the house. For years I had believed keeping peace meant keeping quiet. But standing there in that disorganized kitchen, watching all of them struggle beneath responsibilities I once carried alone, I finally understood something important. Silence was not weakness. Sometimes silence was simply the moment before people are forced to meet the truth. After the disastrous dinner, something inside the house shifted permanently. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the quiet, irreversible way winter arrives overnight, and suddenly every tree outside your window stands bare. Richard stopped making confident declarations about independence. He no longer spoke about separate responsibilities with the same sharp certainty. Instead, he moved through the house like a man constantly trying to remember something important he had forgotten. One Wednesday afternoon, I returned from the grocery store to find him sitting alone at the kitchen table staring at a stack of paperwork spread across the wood surface. His reading glasses rested low on his nose while cold coffee sat untouched beside his elbow. He looked older than I remembered. Not physically older exactly, just worn down in places success had once hidden. There you are, he muttered without looking up. I placed the grocery bags quietly onto the counter. Something wrong. Richard rubbed his forehead tiredly. The Henderson account is threatening to leave. I recognized the name immediately. Henderson Medical Supply had been one of Richard's largest clients for nearly 12 years. I also remembered every Christmas card their office manager sent us because I had personally written the thank you notes back. That is unfortunate, I said softly. Richard exhaled heavily. Apparently someone forgot to renew part of their contract terms last quarter. I remained silent while unpacking apples from a paper bag. Slowly, carefully. Richard looked up at me then, irritation mixing with embarrassment. You used to remind me about these things. The room went still. Outside, thin November sunlight stretched weakly across the backyard while dead leaves drifted against the fence. Yes, I replied quietly. I did. He stared at the paperwork for another long moment before speaking again. Do you enjoy this? I paused beside the sink. Enjoy what? Watching everything fall apart. His voice sounded tired now rather than angry. That difference mattered more than he realized. I rinsed grapes beneath cold water before answering. Richard, your life is not falling apart. You are simply handling alone what I handled alone for decades. He leaned back in the chair slowly, absorbing the words without argument this time. Upstairs, the old grandfather clock ticked steadily through the silence. Finally, he asked quietly, "Did you ever resent me?" The question surprised me. Not because he asked it, because it had taken him nearly 40 years to wonder. I dried my hands carefully with a dish towel before turning toward him. No, I said honestly. I resented becoming invisible. Richard looked down immediately. For the first time since this began, he had no quick defense waiting behind his eyes. Later that evening, after he went upstairs to shower, I carried a small cardboard box down from the attic storage closet. Dust rose softly into the air as I opened it on the dining room table. Old photographs. Birthday cards. School drawings Michael made as a child. At the very bottom rested a faded picture from 1989. Richard and I stood outside our first tiny apartment smiling beside his old pickup truck. We looked exhausted, broke, hopeful. Back then, we used to sit together at the kitchen counter balancing bills with a calculator because we could not afford mistakes. I worked evenings at a department store while Richard tried desperately to keep his small business alive. When Michael was born, daycare cost more than my paycheck. So together we decided I would stay home temporarily. Temporarily became years. Years became identity. Somewhere along the way, my sacrifices transformed into expectations, then eventually into entitlement. Richard entered the dining room quietly while I held the photograph in my hands. He looked toward the picture and stopped walking. "I remember that apartment," he said softly. "The ceiling leaked every time it rained." A faint smile touched my mouth. "And the heater only worked if you kicked the side twice." For a brief moment, something gentle returned between us. Not romance, not forgiveness, just memory. Richard stepped closer to the table slowly. "You really believed in me back then," he murmured. I looked down at the photograph again. Young Richard grinning proudly with one arm around my shoulders. Young Evelyn looking at him like building a hard life together still felt meaningful. "Yes," I answered quietly. "I did." He opened his mouth as though he wanted to say something more. But sometimes people wait too long to become honest, and by the time the truth finally reaches them, silence has already built a home inside the relationship. Thanksgiving arrived beneath a sky the color of ash. Cold wind swept across the neighborhood all morning, carrying dry leaves along the sidewalks while distant chimney smoke drifted through the air. For years, Thanksgiving had belonged entirely to me. I planned the meals weeks in advance, polished silverware nobody else noticed, baked pies from scratch because Richard insisted store-bought desserts tasted cheap. Every detail of the holiday once rested quietly on my shoulders. This year I did nothing, and somehow that changed everything. By noon, the kitchen had already descended into chaos. Richard stood over a turkey that still looked partially frozen while muttering under his breath. Michael searched online for cooking instructions with growing panic, and Claire kept checking her phone every few minutes like she hoped someone more competent might magically appear. I remained upstairs in the bedroom folding scarves into neat stacks inside the dresser. The sounds drifting upward from the kitchen almost felt surreal. Cabinet doors slamming, raised voices, timers ringing unanswered. Finally, around 2 o'clock, Michael knocked softly on the bedroom door. "Mom!" I looked up from the dresser. He stepped inside slowly, exhaustion visible across his face. "We could really use your help downstairs." I studied my son carefully. His tie hung crooked. His hair looked rushed and unevenly combed. For the first time in years, he resembled the overwhelmed young father he had once been before Claire convinced him success meant always appearing polished. "I thought everyone agreed I did not contribute much around here," I said quietly. Michael lowered his eyes immediately. "Mom, please." That single word carried more honesty than anything he had said in weeks. I followed him downstairs slowly. The moment I entered the kitchen, silence spread through the room. Claire stood beside the counter arranging vegetables with sharp, irritated movements while Richard carved uneven slices into the turkey breast. The smell of burnt stuffing lingered heavily in the air. "Well," Claire muttered without looking at me. "Nice of you to finally join us." I walked calmly toward the sink and washed my hands beneath warm water. I was under the impression everyone preferred independence now. Richard set the knife down harder than necessary. "Can we please not do this today?" I dried my hands carefully before turning toward him. "Do what?" "Turn everything into some kind of lesson." Lesson. Interesting choice of words. As though basic respect should have been educational in the first place. Claire crossed her arms immediately. "Honestly, Evelyn, nobody said you had no value." I looked directly at her then. "Your father-in-law called me dead weight in my own dining room." The kitchen fell silent again. Even the old refrigerator hum sounded louder somehow. Michael shifted uncomfortably near the stove while Claire avoided eye contact for the first time since arriving. Richard sighed heavily and rubbed both hands across his face. "I was frustrated," he muttered. "No," I replied softly. "You were honest." The truth settled heavily over the room. Outside, cold rain began tapping against the kitchen windows while fading daylight turned the backyard gray. Richard looked older in that moment than I had ever seen him, Not because of wrinkles or gray hair. Because certainty had finally left him. Claire broke the silence first. This family has been miserable for months because nobody wants to let one comment go. I turned toward her calmly. One comment does not destroy a marriage, I said quietly. It only reveals what has been true for years. Nobody argued, because deep down they all understood it. Slowly, I walked toward the dining room and returned carrying a thick cream-colored folder from the cabinet drawer where I had placed it earlier that morning. Richard frowned immediately. What is that? I set the folder gently onto the kitchen counter and opened it. Property records. Investment accounts. Trust agreements. Old signatures. Old dates. Old truths. Michael stared down at the papers with growing confusion while Claire stepped closer beside him. Richard's face slowly lost color. Where did you get those? He asked quietly. These, I replied, touching the top document softly, are the records showing my inheritance funded the first expansion of your company in 1994. Silence. Complete silence. Michael looked between us in shock. Dad. Richard swallowed hard but said nothing. I opened another document carefully. This one shows. The lake property remains under my family trust. Another paper. And this account helped cover payroll during the recession when your business nearly collapsed. Claire's expression changed instantly. Not sympathy. Calculation. I recognized it immediately. For years, everyone in this family had quietly accepted the story that Richard built everything himself while I simply benefited from his success. But the truth sat plainly across the counter now in black ink and legal signatures. I looked directly at Richard while rain streaked slowly down the windows behind him. You called me worthless because my work never came with a paycheck, I said softly. But without me, there would never have been anything here to protect in the first place. The kitchen remained silent long after my words settled into the room. Rain pressed softly against the windows while steam rose from untouched dishes spread across the counters. Nobody reached for food anymore. Nobody even moved. Michael stared down at the documents like the foundation beneath his childhood had quietly shifted without warning. Claire stood beside him with her lips pressed tightly together, calculating something behind her eyes she no longer bothered hiding. Richard looked at the papers the way people look at old photographs after realizing memory has been kinder than truth. Finally, Michael spoke first. Mom, you helped start Dad's company? His voice sounded smaller somehow, younger. I folded the top document carefully before answering. Your father had the dream, I said softly. But dreams still need money to survive. Richard closed his eyes briefly. Evelyn? I looked at him calmly. Do you remember the winter of 1994? His shoulders stiffened immediately. Of course he remembered. We had nearly lost everything that year. Snowstorms buried Ohio under ice for weeks, while his business loans piled higher than unpaid invoices. Richard barely slept back then. Every night he sat at the kitchen table surrounded by bills while I reheated coffee neither of us finished drinking. My father had only been gone 6 months, I continued quietly. I used nearly all of my inheritance so your employees would still get paid before Christmas. Michael's face changed completely. You never told me that. I smiled faintly. Because families are not supposed to keep score. Richard lowered himself slowly into one of the dining chairs as though his legs no longer trusted him. For the first time in weeks, he looked directly at me without anger. Only regret. I forgot, he admitted quietly. The honesty in his voice almost hurt more than the insult itself. Forgot. Such a simple word for years of sacrifice disappearing beneath comfort and routine. Claire finally stepped forward. Well, she said carefully, that still does not mean Richard built nothing. I turned toward her slowly. I never said he built nothing. My voice remained calm, steady. I said he did not build it alone. Again silence spread across the kitchen. Outside, darkness settled fully over the neighborhood, while rainwater streamed beneath the porch light in silver lines. Michael rubbed both hands across his face before looking toward his father. Dad, is this true? Richard stared down at the table for several seconds before nodding once. Yes. That single word changed something inside the room permanently. Michael sank into the chair beside him slowly, disappointment flickering openly across his expression now. Not because his father accepted help decades ago, because he had spent years rewriting the story afterward. Claire looked increasingly uncomfortable as reality replaced the version of this family she preferred. I just think everyone is making this bigger than it needs to be, she muttered. I looked at her gently. People only say that when they benefited from the smaller version. She had no answer for that. Richard finally lifted his eyes toward me again. Why are you doing this now? He asked quietly. Because you forced me to defend the value of my own life. The words hung heavily between us. Michael looked down immediately while Richard's expression slowly collapsed beneath the weight of understanding. I could almost see the memories returning to him one by one. Every lunch packed before dawn. Every holiday hosted flawlessly. Every forgotten appointment somehow remembered. Every year his mother lived comfortably under our roof while I cared for her through sickness and confusion and loneliness. Invisible work only remains invisible until it stops. I gathered the documents carefully back into the folder, while the smell of overcooked turkey lingered through the house. You know the strangest part? I said softly without looking up. I never wanted credit. I only wanted respect. Richard swallowed hard. Evelyn, But the apology would not come easily now. Some words arrived too late to land where they were needed. Upstairs, the grandfather clock chimed softly through the house. 7 slow echoes rolling through decades of marriage, resentment, sacrifice, and silence. Michael stood first. I think Claire and I should go. Claire opened her mouth slightly, clearly wanting to argue, but one look at his face stopped her. As they gathered their coats near the front door, Michael turned back toward me. His eyes looked damp beneath the hallway light. Mom, he said quietly, I did not know. I nodded once. I know. After they left, the house became silent again except for rain tapping steadily against the roof. Richard remained seated alone at the table while I carried untouched dishes slowly toward the sink. Neither of us spoke for a long time. Then finally, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, Is there still a way to fix this? I stood with my back toward him, warm water running softly over my hands. Outside, wind moved through the dark trees like distant waves. I honestly do not know anymore, I said quietly. If this story touched your heart, do not forget to like this video and share it with someone who understands the silent sacrifices women make every single day. I would truly love to hear your thoughts, so leave a comment below and tell me. Do you think Richard realized Evelyn's value too late? And if you enjoy emotional family drama stories like this one, make sure you subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss our next story.